In the spring of 1955, a document was signed in Warsaw that, on paper, looked like any other military treaty. It spoke of mutual defense, of cooperation, of peace secured through unity. It promised that the nations of Eastern Europe, bound together by common purpose, would stand as one against any threat from the outside world. In reality, it was something far more fragile and far more coercive. The Warsaw Pact was not born of confidence, it was born of fear. A decade earlier, Europe had been reduced to wreckage, cities lay flattened, populations were displaced, old regimes had collapsed, and new ones were being assembled from the ruins. Out of that destruction emerged two victorious powers who no longer trusted one another, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their armies had met in the heart of Germany, but their visions for the future of the world were already pulling in opposite directions. The alliance that had defeated Hitler dissolved almost overnight. What followed was not another war, but something colder, quieter, and in many ways more enduring. The struggle not just for territory, but for systems, for loyalty, for the political soul of half the planet. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week, and we welcome any feedback. By the late 1940s, Europe was being divided into two spheres. In the West, American money and influence flowed through the Marshall Plan. In the East, Soviet power hardened into occupation, and then something more permanent. Communist governments loyal to Moscow were installed across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Some arrived through elections, most through pressure, purges, and the slow elimination of alternatives. By 1949, the Western Bloc had formalized its own military alliance, NATO. From the Kremlin's perspective, this was not defensive, it was encirclement. For several years, Stalin relied on something simpler than treaties. He relied on the Red Army. Soviet troops were already stationed across Eastern Europe. Control did not need paperwork, it only needed presence. But after Stalin's death in 1953, the system began to shift. The new Soviet leadership wanted something that looked more orderly, more legitimate, more like a partnership and less like an occupation. And in 1955, when West Germany was allowed to join NATO and begin rearming, Moscow decided that the time for a formal counter-alliance had come. The Warsaw Pact was signed on the 14th of May. Its full name was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. The words were carefully chosen. They suggested equality, voluntary participation, shared purpose. In practice, there was never any doubt as to who was in charge. The Soviet Union was not merely the leading member of the pact, it was its axis. Its armies were its backbone. Its officers filled its command structures. Its strategic priorities determined its plans. The other members, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, were not so much allies as managed dependencies. On paper, the pact was defensive. It pledged mutual aid in the event of an attack. It established a unified command structure. It created mechanisms for consultation and coordination. But there was an unspoken clause that mattered far more. Membership was not something you could easily leave. The Warsaw Pact was not simply an alliance against the West, it was also an instrument for controlling the East. Nowhere was this clearer than in 1956. That year, in Hungary, something unexpected happened. A popular uprising broke out against the communist government. It began as a student protest. It became a national revolt. Statues of Stalin were pulled down. Political prisoners were freed. And for a moment, it seemed as though Hungary might break away from the Soviet system altogether. The new Hungarian government announced its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. The response was not negotiation. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. The uprising was crushed, thousands were killed, a new, more obedient government was installed. The message was unambiguous. The pact was not just a shield, it was a cage. From that moment on, its true function was clear. The Warsaw Pact did not merely exist to deter NATO, it existed to guarantee that the political order of Eastern Europe would not be allowed to change. Through the 1960s, the alliance grew more elaborate. Joint exercises were held, plans were drawn up for a hypothetical war that everyone hoped would never come. The scenario was always the same. NATO forces would attack, and the armies of the Pact would surge forward, through Germany towards the Channel. It was a war planned in maps and staff rooms, in documents stamped secret and top secret, in calculations that assumed the early use of nuclear weapons. No one expected it to remain conventional for long. Behind the rhetoric of solidarity, however, the Pact was not as unified as it pretended. Each member state had its own fears, its own ambitions, its own memories of Soviet liberation. Poland remembered 1939. Hungary remembered 1956. Czechoslovakia remembered Munich, then Moscow. And in 1968, these tensions surfaced again. That year, the Czechoslovak government began a series of reforms that became known as the Prague Spring. Censorship was relaxed, political debate widened, the regime spoke of socialism with a human face. To the Soviet leadership, this was not reform, it was infection. Once again, the Warsaw Pact was invoked. Troops from several member states crossed into Czechoslovakia and occupied the country. The reform movement was ended. Its leaders were removed. The justification that followed became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, the idea that no socialist country had the right to change its system in a way that threatened the whole bloc. In other words, sovereignty existed only within strict limits. Not all members were comfortable with this role. Romania began to pursue a more independent foreign policy, even while remaining inside the pact. Albania withdrew entirely after falling out with Moscow and aligning with China. But these were exceptions. For most of its existence, the Warsaw Pact functioned as the military expression of political reality. That Eastern Europe was not free to choose its own path. Militarily, it was formidable. The combined forces of the Pact outnumbered NATO's in Europe. Its armies were built for mass, speed, and depth. Its doctrine emphasized overwhelming force, rapid advance, and early escalation. But it also had weaknesses. Its equipment was uneven, its logistics were complex, its armies were not equally motivated, and its entire structure depended on the assumption that, in the final analysis, Soviet troops would do the decisive fighting. Beneath the surface, another problem was growing. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the system that the Warsaw Pact existed to protect was visibly decaying. Economics stagnated, public trust eroded, dissent simmered. In Poland, the Solidarity movement emerged, a trade union that became a national opposition. For the first time, a mass, organized challenge to communist rule existed inside the pact itself. This time, Soviet tanks did not roll. The leadership in Moscow was changing. The old certainties were weakening. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he brought with him a new, dangerous idea that the system might survive only if it stopped relying on force. The Brezhnev Doctrine was quietly abandoned, and with that, the foundation of the Warsaw Pact began to crack. In 1989, one by one, the regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed, not through invasion, not through war, but through demonstrations, negotiations, and in some cases, the simple refusal of governments to keep pretending. The Berlin Wall opened, the borders shifted, communist parties stepped inside, and the armies of the Warsaw Pact stayed inside their barracks. In February 1991 in Budapest, the member states formally agreed to dismantle the alliance. In July, the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist. It ended not with an explosion, but with paperwork. For 36 years, it had been presented as a shield against aggression. In reality, it had been something far more complex and more tragic, a mechanism for freezing history in place, for enforcing a political order that could not reform itself without unraveling. It had kept peace in Europe, but only by making change impossible. And when change finally came, it discovered that it had no purpose left at all. The alliance that had once been created to hold an empire together vanished almost overnight, and the empire followed soon after.